Hello and welcome to January 2nd, 2026. We're one day into this fresh, brand new year, and yesterday on the program we talked about, the fact that as much as we're in a new year, it reminds me of an old year of 1990. If you want a refresher on yesterday's message, please check out the video stored on Facebook or YouTube. But today, we're on Friday, and I want to talk about the spiritual path with you. This is one of the 5 paths to a transformed life that I've developed for myself, and I'm sharing with you in the hopes that we together can empower our lives even more and power them into a new era of digital economics. But today, on the Friday, we do talk about the spiritual path. Now, I've told you this is my path for a rock-solid foundation of everything I believe. And I am, as I've said, a Christian. I believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But I know some of you won't. Some of you will have a different spiritual path. I hope that we'll have the courtesy to talk with one another about those differences and learn together, because I believe that intelligence and intellect play to religious truth, not away from it. So we're going to look at the intellectual realities of Christianity over time and of other faiths too, but we'll look specifically at the Christian faith because that's where my spiritual path leads. Today, I'm going to talk about what is, I guess, the apostle that I most relate with. I mean, if we look at the apostles and you look at the apostle Paul, he went out and he, was a mercenary against Christians. Well, I've never been in that camp. I don't do that. I've not had to convert from someone who hated the faith to someone who supported it. I'm certainly not like John, who just felt love for the Lord and felt that his love of the deity of Jesus Christ was enough to push him forward. And I'm not as strong as Peter. But I look at Thomas, and I look at the reality of a man who came up on that subsequent events to the resurrection and said, unless I see it, I can't believe it. I don't want to believe secondhand news. I don't want to believe rumor. I want to see the truth. Well, in that, he showed a level of humanity that I can certainly relate with. I will tell you, and I share personally on this, my life hasn't always been one about easy faith. It's been difficult for me sometimes in my life, especially in my earlier years, to know that the Christ was real. I could talk about it, I could say it, but in my heart of hearts, did I know it? As I get older and I find more reading and more substance and more support for the scriptures, I become more faithful. But Thomas clearly resonates, at least with me. Now, I think what's interesting, Jesus didn't scold him for his lack of faith. He came up and showed him. He said, look in my hands. Look at the scars that I bear. So Jesus didn't really criticize him. But what he did do is say, what is perhaps the most important thing in Scripture? Maybe the most important line: blessed are those who've not seen and yet believe. But you and I, have faith all the time. We just don't think of it as such. We have faith that when we get in our car, it's going to start. You have faith when you invest in a relationship that it's going to work out. You have faith, as I've done, that when you start a business, it's going to work. These are faith things by their nature. I mean, we live by faith much more than we want to admit. So the real question is, what is your faith anchored to? And what does this faith produce in our lives? Well, today we're going to follow that as we travel down the Steve Beeman journey.
In a world of uncertainty, where business, freedom, and the future hang in the balance, one voice rises with clarity, experience, wisdom, and conviction. This is the Steve Beeman Show, the voice of the independent American.
Welcome back to the journey, my friends, and welcome to this Friday, The Spiritual Path, where we talk about faith, finance, freedom, and the future. It is built for the independent American. There are 35 million independent business people in this country, and that's the people I relate with. I've never worked for the big Fortune 100 companies. I've consulted with them, but I've never worked for them. And I find that my heart is dead centered on the entrepreneurial America. It's everyone from Henry Ford to Milton Hershey, Steve Jobs. You go down the list of the entrepreneurs who've made this country the place it is. The millionaire next door, all those small businesses with elevator shops and plumbing shops and contracting shops and auto maintenance shops. the independent Americans who make it on their own with their own strength. That's who this is dedicated to. Now, before we go, as I do every day, before we go into our topic today, I do want to talk about news of the day. And unquestionably, the biggest news this day is the election of Mamdani in New York. This isn't a political program. I don't want to talk politics, but I will tell you that there's a cultural difference here between Mamdani and myself. He came out, and I posted a picture of this, and said the era of the individual, rugged individualism is over. We're now into the era of collectivism. Well, I, as an independent American, don't agree with that. I don't think there's an example in history where aggregated collectivism works. I believe the individualism of America is what made it great and what made it strong. I think when Japan at the beginning of World War II said, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping tiger," it was that individualism that was the power behind the American economy. It's individuals like you who go out and get up every day and fight the fight, who hire people, invent new things, do all of it. You pay the taxes for the roads, you belong to the church committees and the school committees. It's you, the independent American, who make this thing work. So when I see the mayor of America's largest city coming out saying that the era of individualism is over, I fear for that. I don't think it plays well for you or for me who want individually to run our lives. That's today's news. But let me talk about the fact that today's path, I think, if I talk about the Gospel of Thomas and I talk about the reality of him as it affects my life, it's not abstract. It's extremely practical. And again, let's go back. Thomas wasn't in the room when Jesus first appeared to the apostles. He came in later. And he said, "I'm not doing secondhand faith. Unless I see the wounds and touch them, I won't believe." Now, people mock him for that, right? We have the whole doubting Thomas thing, and we mock him. But I find him to be much more in line with, well, frankly, me and a lot of people I know. It's not easy to just believe. But, as I said earlier, Jesus didn't come in and crush him. He met him right where he was. He said, "Put your finger here. See my wounds." And then he did say, as I said again earlier, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." So it leads to a question about what is faith? What is our faith? How do we show our faith? Because faith certainly isn't pretending. It's not ignoring evidence. It's not positive thinking. Biblical faith is closer to faith being trust in what is true, strong enough to change how you live. And that's the test. It's not whether you say you believe, but it's whether your belief changes your decisions. You show your faith by what you do when you're not full of certainty. You rely on the faith to fill in the gaps. You forgive when it's easier to be angry. You tell the truth when a lie would benefit you. You work when you don't feel like it. You give when you could hoard. These are the types of things that show our faith. You pray when you can't control outcomes. You stay steady when the world wants you to be chaotic and frantic. In other words, faith can show up in our lives as discipline, the word disciple. So how can knowledge push our faith forward? And I think the key for people like me and people like Thomas generally is that some people treat faith and knowledge like enemies. I don't. I believe knowledge can do two things. First, it can clear the fog. A lot of doubt, as I look at it, isn't rebellion, it's confusion. And when you learn and when you have the intellectual side of it down, you understand what the apostles really faced. How real was this for them? What early believers were willing to die for? The first martyr, Stephen. What motivated him to go to his death in faith? How did the Gospels hold all this together? I mean, what were the early church fathers? What did they teach? We have pretty good documentation, not just from the Gospels and the scriptures contained in the Bible, but there are extracurricular items outside of the Bible that talk about the early church fathers. We know how this church grew. It was based on faith. And I'm going to talk about what that means to me in a minute. But clearly, if we look at what shaped civilization and the impacts of Christianity on it, we know that the fog has been cleared, because you can't prove God like a mathematical equation, but you can prove him by the outcomes of the changes you see. And we've seen certainly massive changes take place as a result of that singular event that took place 2,000 years ago, the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I think if you clear away cheap objections, you can create intellectual room for belief to grow and to breathe. But the second thing it can do is it can build confidence. Faith isn't the absence of questions. Faith is a decision to trust God in the presence of questions. I mean, it helps you say, you don't look at this with enough knowledge and say it's based on fantasy. What you say is this is grounded in truth. And as I said earlier, the more I study, the more I learn, the more I understand the truth of history, the more committed I am to the truth of the scriptures. And that all comes down to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In my life, it's been easy for me to believe in God. Einstein said at the end of his day there had to be a supreme being, because the mathematical perfection of the universe is such that it couldn't have happened randomly. That was easy. It was easy for me to believe in Jesus. I know he lived. That's a historical fact. He was crucified. There's no question. I mean, these are supported both within the scriptures, outside the scriptures. So the personage of Jesus was real. The sacrifice he made was real. The question in my mind always came down to the resurrection, because the consequence of the resurrection is enormous. And I want you to think about it, because if I say I've labored over this in my life, that would be an understatement. Because here's the truth. If the resurrection happened, that is the single most important event in the history of the world. It proves that Jesus was the Son of God. Proves it. So the question that you have to ask, and I have, is did the resurrection really happen? And the way I've looked at it is Thomas. He clearly changed after an event that happened in the upper room. Clearly. He went out to found churches in Asia and all over. He went out with a passion and a zeal. All of the apostles, they were of Peter. He denied him. He was afraid to be seen with him. When they were in the upper room after the burial, they were not celebrating. They'd yet to understand what Jesus had said when he said, tear down this temple and in 3 days I'll rebuild it. They didn't know what that meant. These men changed their lives. And in terms of cultural change, look at the story of Mary Magdalene. This was the first time in history that a woman was elevated to the position she was in. These are unique things. And then, of course, there is the Apostle Paul, a person who was converted completely and went out to his own death. Something happened to these people. And if it was the resurrection, which I believe it was, it begs the question, is there anything more important in our lives than that event? If that resurrection is true, and I increasingly believe it is, then the reality of salvation is true. And if that's true, how dare any of us who claim to be believers do anything other than preach the salvation of Jesus Christ each and every day? We hold the keys to the kingdom. And it's not based on a blind faith. It's based on an intellectual understanding of what really happened. That's the intellectual side of faith. It's not fantasy. It's based on reality. And it's why I feel compelled in the 5 paths to talk with you, yes, about the future and what's going to happen in the digital economy. I want to talk about finance and tokenized economies and what that means. I want to talk about attitude and perseverance and that strength to carry on when you don't think you can. But mine always comes down at the end of the day to my faith. Because I know there is a God. I know that. I wrote an article once called The Mathematical Proof of God, and it was kind of a play on string theory, if you're familiar with particle physics. In string theory, it's a theory that demands that there are 11 or 12 dimensions to the universe. We can't begin to comprehend that. We can barely think in 3, let alone 4, 5, 6 dimensions. But I wrote, so believing in God for me was always there. We know that Jesus lived. That's a historical fact. It's as real as Ben Franklin or any of those people. I mean, we know he lived. And I believe we know and can know that he rose from the dead. The impact of that single event on the lives of the apostles, the early church, and all throughout the history of Western civilization for the last 2,000 years has been enormous. And you can say, oh, well, Christianity's done bad things. I would argue that men have done bad things. Christianity offers one thing: love. And from that follows with salvation. It doesn't talk about political things. It doesn't talk about, you have something I want, I'm going to be entitled to your property. It doesn't talk about those things. It talks about salvation, that we as people are separated from the Creator. And Jesus came as a propitiation for that sin, which, by the way, is just separation. So I believe that Thomas is a really good example for those of us who say, okay, I've had my doubts. Please help me believe. Please help me know more about Scripture that I might be faithful. So as we talk about a new year, a new season on this, the first spiritual path that I'm doing, I want to talk about 4 things that I want to really agree to do with you. Number 1, I will pursue truth, not comfort, in everything that I do. Number 2, I will practice faith as a discipline, not just a mood. Number 3, I will build my life on what lasts, which is faith in those scriptures. And number 4, in my daily activities, I will remember that God is real, especially in those times when I can't see the outcome. My mistakes don't condemn God. They just give him an opportunity to help me. Now, if you want a simple daily little practice, and I like to have some pragmatic stuff to these little podcasts, there are 3 things I'd like you to consider. Take 1 minute each day in gratitude. Find 3 things that you're grateful for. It could be your health, it could be your financial situation, it could be your faith, it could be a number of things. In my life, if I were to list out those things I'm grateful for, it would cover the pages of a book. Then 1 minute to pray for wisdom and courage, because those are at the core of acting out the faith that we need to have. And finally, 1 act of obedience, a truth that you will live today. If you do those 3 things once a day, it becomes real, because it becomes a habit. It becomes part of our daily routine. So on Monday, when we come back, we're going to be talking about the financial path, and we're talking about cash flow versus income. So I'm going to give you a simple dashboard to take a look at how to measure cash flow versus income. It's kind of important as we travel that journey down the financial path. But for today, if you find this podcast interesting, I welcome you to share it. Obviously, the more people in our community, the better. And I am doing this because I believe in us. I believe in the independent American. You'll hear me say it time and time again. It's the millionaire next door that built this country, and I want to continue that for my children and for my grandchildren. So for today, though, this is the Steve Beeman Journey. I'm Steve Beeman, and we're all about